Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Nita Raghawansi, President of Music Managers Forum US. And thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to have this panel. It's a topic that is near and dear to my heart, having worked in the area for a very long time. So what we have here is MMF webinar expert encounter number 2, the neighboring rights unpacked. Expert Encounter is a series that we've kicked off where we bring in a lot of amazing experts on a variety of topics that we think will be important for your businesses and your career, and hopefully will send you away with some good, valuable information, some good action points, something to work on, especially during this crazy year that we're having. So just a quick background on Music Managers Forum. MMF-US is the 27-year-old trade organization for artist managers and self-managed artists. We try to help to, we work inside of a variety of initiatives, one of them being advocacy work, to work on a variety of rights issues that may come up on Capitol Hill, issues that come up in state legislatures that affect artist managers and their artists. We work inside of industry coalitions with other music organizations on all sorts of issues. More recently, it's been about the CARES Act and the second incarnation and the third incarnation, and trying to make sure that we work through the issues with independent contractors, self-employed individuals, to make sure that they're getting what is owed to them properly, and that their particular way of doing business is well represented in the legislation. There's a variety of issues, and so we do encourage you to go to MMF-US.com, check out our website. Please sign up for our newsletter. We have a newsletter that comes out occasionally that gives you a lot of good information. There's a great membership benefit that you get a free subscription to Music Ally. So we do encourage you to join MMF-US if you are not a member. It's $75 a year. And again, you can go to our website and find out more and click on join to start that process. We are an all-volunteer organization. If you're interested in helping out with the leadership and the volunteer work of helping MMF in its mission and goals, we also encourage you to contact me, Nita, N-E-E-T-A, at MMFUS.com, because I would love to hear from you if you'd like to help out and see where we could put you into. So we are, we definitely are very thankful to those companies and organizations who help partner and support the work of MMF. And we are incredibly thankful and grateful to Iberia Bank and First Horizon Bank for their amazing support of this wonderful webinar. I wanted to introduce you to a fabulous person who's been incredibly supportive of the music industry at large, and we're so thankful to have her here. Just to mention, Iberia Bank and First Horizon Bank have actually combined. The two banks have combined and joined forces, and so that combination will very soon operate under the First Horizon name. But here we have for you, Peggy. I just was like looking, for your fabulous title. But anyhow, I just wanted to introduce you to the fabulous Peggy Dole. Peggy is Senior Vice President of Sports and Entertainment Banking for Iberia and First Horizon Bank, which are the two well-established financial institutions I just mentioned that merged 2 months ago. So Peggy, I would love for you to jump in and tell us a little bit about yourself as well as your company.
Thank you, Nita. Hi, everybody. When the Iberia Bank Sports and Entertainment Group invited me to lead its music division, they wanted somebody from inside of the music industry, where I've worked for 39 years, who understands the complexities of the industry's economics so that we can better serve our music clients. To that end, we're very proud to support the Music Managers Forum and these qualified, esteemed panelists Nita has assembled to educate our music industry community about this misunderstood but extremely vital and important revenue stream. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Peggy. Thanks for being here. So, without further ado, let's get started with the content. Actually, first, we're going to introduce you, if you haven't already met, the fabulous Wesley O'Hara, our MMF Vice President of Membership and Education, who will give us some instructions on using this crazy GoToWebinar since we're not a Zoom organization. Go for it, Wes.
Hi, everybody. I'm Wesley O'Hara. As Nita said, I'm the Vice President of Membership and Education. If this is your first time using GoToWebinar, there are a couple things to note. There is a questions section in your GoToWebinar control panel. If you could please write any questions that you have for the panelists in there, then that's the list that we're going to go through for Q&A at the end and answer anything that is very relevant and the panelists have not yet covered. And then there is additionally a chat section further down in the control panel. If you're having any technical difficulties, feel free to send to organizer there, and that will send me any messages that you have, what troubles you're having. These webinars are recorded and will go up on our YouTube channel eventually. So don't worry if you miss everything, it will be up online and edited to perfection afterwards. So yeah, overall questions, ask them if you have them, chat. If you need troubleshooting, hit me up.
Okay, so questions into the question section on the right-hand, or wherever your control panel is on your screen. Mine's on the right-hand side. Thank you so much, Wesley. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, I want to thank all of our panelists for being here, so thank you. I'm going to, let's see, get started with introductions. I'm going to go in the order in which I have everyone on my screen. So Carlo, please introduce yourself to our audience.
Thank you very much, Nita. It's an honor to be here today, especially with these fellow panelists who are pretty infamous in the neighboring rights sector. Just briefly, I head up international accounts with Premier Music based out of Montreal, Canada. I'm also a performing and recording artist as well. So that's pretty much it for me.
Thanks. Welcome, Carlo. Anne, let's have Anne.
I'm Anne. I'm CEO of Cobalt Neighboring Rights. I have been in that role for the last 7 years. Prior to Cobalt, I was at Universal Publishing. I have worked with music rights all my life, basically. Yeah, worked in publishing for a very long time, and also have had a stint at a collection society. So yeah, that is me. And I also co-founded IFR together with Naomi back in 2018.
Wonderful. Welcome, Anne. Thank you so much. Ryan.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ryan Lenning. I'm the Senior Director of International at SoundExchange. I've been doing that role for almost, 8 or 9 years now. And prior to joining SoundExchange, I was an attorney in the law department at Sony BMG in New York. And before that, I was in private practice with a law firm in DC, practicing copyright law.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ryan, and welcome. Naomi.
Hi, thank you again for having us and for doing this. So I'm Vice President of International Neighboring Rights at Sony ATV. I started there in January of this year. Before that, I was at Wixon Music for 10 years in the UK, which I co-founded the UK company where I did publishing and neighboring rights. And in 2018, Anne and I co-founded IFR.
Great. Naomi, can you tell us a little bit about IFR? I know some of our members, they were asking me about it earlier. I'm like, we'll get Naomi to tell us.
So basically, a few years ago, I was sort of felt like I was pounding my head against a brick wall with a few industry-wide issues. And, you know, I just knew it wasn't something that was only me, that it was the same issues affected everybody. I talked to Anne, and she had said that she'd felt the same way and had actually tried to do something as well. So we decided to join forces and create essentially like the MPA and MPA, but for neighboring rights. So its goals include education, advocacy, and community. So we want to provide a space where anybody can come for neutral advice. We've got a subcommittee of non-representatives to handle people who have questions about, you know, choosing a representative. We have, you know, advocacy in the sense that, you know, there's a lot going on in the world. In this income stream, it's not a very transparent one. It's not a very you know, there's no sort of international uniformity of any kind. It's actually the complete opposite in pretty much every way. And trying to work through some of those issues as colleagues. And even though, you know, we're obviously competitors, you know, anything that we can do to better the income stream as a whole is going to benefit anybody involved in the income stream. So that's, you know, one of the main goals as well. And then, yeah, just a place where people can ask questions, because a lot of people have a lot of, you know, questions about this income stream and things don't always make sense. So trying to provide support in that respect as well.
Wonderful. That's great to hear. So I'm glad you guys are around. Naomi, so I'm going to actually start with you in terms of diving into neighboring rights. I see a lot of the names here of our attendees, and I know a lot of them are well versed, but I also think there's some new names in here. Could you run us through, I mean, I think you have a PowerPoint, right? If you could just run us through some of the
I think Wesley is going to try and bring the PowerPoint up, but if he fails, then I can do it.
Okay, Wesley, pull up a PowerPoint.
Just one
Naomi's
second.
gonna walk us through some of the not just the basics, but a good, well-structured sort of discussion on what is neighboring rights. So we're all in
Neighboring
this.
rights 101.
Exactly. Here we go. Go for
Okay. So we can move on to the next page. So this is just a basic, what are neighboring rights? Neighboring rights sit next to publishing, which is why they're called neighboring rights, because they neighbor publishing copyrights. Anybody who makes an audible contribution on a recording gets paid. It doesn't matter if you've just played the triangle, if you're the guy who yells, if you can't have any pudding, if you don't eat your meat on the Pink Floyd The Wall track, or if it's, you know, the top A-list stars in the world. Anybody who makes an audible contribution is eligible to get neighboring rights. And most territories around the world, sound recording royalties come from license fees, as well as radio and television broadcast. SoundExchange is slightly different. In the US, you just get satellite and digital radio, and the rest of the world is any venue pays a music license, and you get it from terrestrial or digital radio. I know Ryan's going to go into a lot more detail about SoundExchange later, so I'll only touch on, mostly say, and Ryan will talk about this later for anything that's US based. Go to the next slide, please. There are some sources that don't pay. Most of them are streaming sources. Interactive streaming doesn't pay. So essentially Spotify, YouTube, Deezer, Apple Music, Amazon Prime, those sources don't pay. Now there are some countries where that's changing. And I know that Anne can probably elaborate better than me on the Article 18 initiatives happening in Europe in terms of trying to have, trying to get interactive streaming to pay neighboring rights. Spain's already recently won lawsuits against Spotify. Hungary is now paying for Deezer. So that is something that's very, very fluid at the moment.
Hey, can I jump in for a quick sec? Just on that first slide, just because I know there's some folks out there who just, that very, very basic thing. Yeah. I just wanted to sort of be clear, which is neighboring rights is the performance royalty on the sound recording, on the masters.
It's audible contribution. It's different from artist royalties. Nothing to do with artist royalties.
Nothing to do with artist royalties?
Right. It's separate from artist royalties. It's a different payment.
Sorry. So when you say artist, you mean the recording artist?
So if an artist signs the label, there's going to be an agreement in their contract with the label, and they would receive interactive income via the label for those deals. But that's not coming from the public performance license. That's not going to come from the same sources that neighboring rights pays.
Right. This is as it pertains to streaming services. Right, you're talking about right now. I was backing up almost to the very beginning 101, the first slide, and I just wanted to make sure folks got this clear, because if not, they'll get lost. Which is that when we talk about performance rights, we're talking about the recording artists who go, the artists who go into the recording studio and perform on the recording, featured artists and session musicians and vocalists, which are called non-featured artists.
Anybody who makes an audible contribution to a recording.
Right, and the owner of the sound recording copyright.
Yes. They will also get paid a percentage of neighboring rights, yes.
Which is typically the record label. I just want to make sure our audience gets that super straight, because I know we went through it quite fast. And for those who need the 101, I just want to make sure that they understand that this is not
I
what
have a diagram a couple slides away, and that breaks it up even more.
Okay, but I want to make sure they understand this is not the ASCAP or BMI royalties. that
Totally nothing to do with that at all.
This is not for publishers, the owners of, or those who administrate the underlying musical composition copyright. That's a separate copyright. We're talking about the sound recording copyright. Okay, keep going.
Okay.
Okay.
The just next thing to mention on this slide is roles that don't pay. This is really important because this is something that we get asked a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people do, that these roles are not payable roles in terms of neighboring rights. Now, I know Ryan's going to talk more about SoundExchange, so I won't really look at that item, but you know, if you PPL, GVL, any of these CMOs around the world in different countries, they're not going to pay for remixer, arranger, engineer, executive producer, mixer. Those are considered non-payable roles. So it's important to, if you're making neighboring rights claims and you're somebody who is a producer, I'll have more slides about that later on, that you look and see whether your role is payable or not.
And also to add here, one important thing, because it's very often that a producer would also play instruments, and it's very important that you document each individual instrument that you're actually playing. So don't just say all instrument, but actually specify them one by one, because that's the kind of evidence that the CMOs are looking for to see that you participated on a recording. So that's a very important item.
Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another just example of who gets paid on a recording. So the example we have here, a contracted featured artist, for instance, if it's the Rolling Stones, would be Mick Jagger. It can be, if it's the Rolling Stones featuring Lady Gaga, in this example, in the societies that have an other featured category, she would be other featured. And then you have any non-featured performer. So that'd be a session player, for instance, Bobby Keys playing the saxophone on a Rolling Stones track. So he would have been just hired as a session player. He's not a part of the Rolling Stones. So a lot of people have questions about what category they fall in. We always say, look at the contract with the label. It always goes back for us as to what is the contract with the label. Next slide, please. All right, and here's a diagram that I think deals with the questions that you were asking me a minute ago. So in, say, Starbucks in London is playing Whitney Houston's version of I Will Always Love You. There's two separate payments that go to, from that public performance broadcast. So there's going to be a publishing payment, which is going to be split between the publisher and the artist. That's going to go to Dolly Parton and her publisher. That is not going to go anywhere near the neighboring rights income, and it is a completely separate sort of arrow on the chart, if you will. Then there's going to be
just clarify, because Naomi, you actually said the artist, so this is actually, it's going to the public company and the writer, songwriter.
You're right. So the writer. It could have been somebody else other than Dolly Parton who wrote it. In this particular case, it was Dolly Parton. It goes to the writer and her publisher. Then there's the line that goes to the sound recording, and then roughly 50% will go to RCA, her label, or the label in this case. And then the other roughly 50% of that particular payment is going to be split between Whitney Houston and then anybody else who played on the recording, anybody who made an audible contribution to the recording. So does that help, Nita, in terms of answering your question, that the ASCAP BMI item is the Dolly Parton side, and then the SoundExchange, PPL, et cetera, side is the Whitney Houston side?
Absolutely, thank you.
Next slide, please. And again, this also just kind of drums in how this is different from publishing, that it's earned by the performers on the recording. Publishing has no basis on this, no bearing whatsoever. So essentially, neighboring rights royalties are the equivalent of performing royalties collected by ASCAP, by all of those organizations, but it is not those. It's the sound recording side of that. So in this, for instance, SoundExchange is the US, PPL is the UK, and then this last line is vital to know, especially outside of the US, is if the rights holder, which is usually the label, does not register the tracks ahead of time, the artist will never get paid ever. And the little asterisk is there because at SoundExchange it's slightly different. And Ryan will talk more about that. But if you have something that's playing in Europe, you need to make sure your label is registered in. Next slide, please. And here's another example, just sort of drumming home that if you have something that, Valerie, the writers are paid from PRS, ASCAP, and BMI, if you play their recording of Valerie, then that'll get paid by PPL as well. But if it's Amy Winehouse's recording of Valerie, which gets a lot more airplay than the Zootons recording of Valerie, then it's paid by PPL and SoundExchange. So that again shows you the separate income streams. All right, next. This slide deals with the rights holder and the producers. The word producer can often refer to who owns the master recording. So when you say producer to one of the European societies, they'll a lot of the time think you're talking about the label. You have to differentiate and say you're talking about a studio producer. And obviously Ryan will talk about SoundExchange and producers. There are some societies that pay for the performer and the label. There are some that only pay the label. There are some that only pay the performer. And sometimes if you say producer, they'll direct you to the rights holder or the label side. So that's why you have to be very specific about studio producer. And this just sort of breaks that down a little bit. UK, PPL pays both the label and the performer. Belgium, Playwright, for instance, only pays the performer. In Brazil, not only do they pay the performer and the label, but they also pay publishing. So they just really like to confuse you in Brazil.
I mean, just going back to the Playwright example, there's then another society that only deals with the label side, SIMIM. So yeah, sometimes there's two different organizations dealing with different rights. In France, you even have one society dealing with the featured share of the performer share, and then one other society dealing with the non-featured, and you have two societies dealing with the label share. So yeah, it's a split across 4 societies there. And then, as Naomi said, Brazil is they have lots of societies in Brazil, and they do lots of different rights there as well.
Yeah. And then there's a reciprocity issue. So some countries do pay US performers if the master is recorded in a Rome Convention country, performed by a citizen of a Rome Convention country, or funded by a Rome Convention country label. And this designation of Rome Convention, just to explain that for a minute, there was a treaty in 1961, and the US opted out because the broadcasters didn't want to pay 2 sets of royalties, in a nutshell. And that issue has sort of been a reoccurring one that I think Ryan will again talk more about later. But essentially there is a reciprocity issue in quite a few countries. It's the whole, well, you won't pay Paul McCartney, so we won't pay Billy Joel kind of attitude towards, well, we'll only pay you for satellite and digital because that's all you're paying us, or it's essentially a decision not to pay what's considered to be a non-qualifying performer because, if you're at the Starbucks in New York, they're only going to pay the publishing. That other arm that went to Whitney Houston doesn't exist. So because that is the case in the US, then there isn't the equivalent payment from some other countries. But then you have other countries like Britain, which pays the label for the non-qualifying share. So it does get a little bit murky, but there is a reciprocity issue with Americans. Next slide. And again, this is just going back to the idea of metadata being included and what Anne was saying, because if you don't credit your performers, then it's harder for them to claim. If you've got a producer who also played instruments, if you're the label and you put that producer down in your metadata as having played the instruments, it'll be a lot easier for that producer to get paid. So you need to make sure that your data is accurate. And obviously, I'm sure Ryan will talk about the RIAA designation as well. Next slide. So here you have studio producers. SoundExchange, obviously, Ryan will talk about, and that requires a letter of direction. In the UK, you need an eligible studio producer form. In Switzerland, there's an artistic producer form. And as Anne was saying, if you're only credited with being a producer without these forms, you need to be credited as, you need to have something that says you played a different instrument. Otherwise, you're not going to get paid. Next slide. And this just breaks it down to the point where even though this is the same thing, if you're credited as a beats producer, you're not going to be an eligible performer. If you're accredited as a drum programmer, you are. It's only language, but it makes a big difference in your ability to earn income. Next slide, please. And then this just points out that samples get paid as well. So if you've got a recording like Bootylicious that includes a direct sample of Stevie Nicks' Edge of 17, all of the musicians who contributed to Edge of 17 could be eligible. If you play the guitar and it's only the guitar that's sampled, you'll be paid. The drummer won't be paid. It depends on what's included, what has been directly sampled, but it is a good income stream for musicians that have been sampled quite a lot. Next slide, please. And this issue, which is basically, what is a mandate? You hear a lot in neighboring rights, what is a mandate? And I know this is a really complicated slide with a lot of arrows, but you essentially have the performer, you have the CMO, and you have agents. And the performer has an inherent unassignable right to collect their equitable remuneration, which is essentially neighboring rights. That performer can ask an agent to collect it on their behalf, and then the agent will essentially do all the work to make that happen. The performer can go directly to a CMO, but here you have essentially, it's your mandate for your equitable remuneration. And one thing that we see is a lot of overlapping, essentially a request to give a mandate to person A or person B. If you have already affiliated for the world for SoundExchange and you try to then affiliate for a PPL in the UK or Senate in the Netherlands, you need to change your mandate at SoundExchange. So it's just something that you hear a lot. Your mandates, there's a mandate conflict, and there are some organizations that are easier to work with in terms of mandate conflicts than others, shall we say. But it is something that is a very important thing to be aware of, is what's going on with your mandate. Have you given it to anybody? Next slide, please. And this just, sort of highlights a few of those points that I already mentioned. And in the US, only public performance by non-interactive digital sources get paid. US, Australian, South African artists are non-qualifying. And session players can earn a lot of money on this track because, if you've got a track like Happy Christmas, the War is Over, played continuously from October to January, then the drummer on that's probably going to earn a ton of money overseas. So it's just a really important one to be aware of. Next, please. Okay, so I'm not going to go through these. There's 3 of these. It's who pays for what. I know this will be circulated at the end. This breaks down every potential source of income and who then receives it, the artist or the composer. So this is something that it's a good reference tool, but something I'm not going to spend an hour talking about right now. And you go to the last slide, please. Next one. Okay, and then this is anybody who's watching this webinar. If you would like to join IFR, we really, really need your support. We're a new organization. We're looking for sponsorship. We're looking for members. We'd love people who want to be involved. Anybody with a positive, proactive attitude who wants to, help change this income stream for the better, please become a member. Please get in touch with us and, get involved. And there's a discount code at the bottom there, which is actually really small writing, I think, IFR NR 2020. And if you're watching this and you put that into the website when you join, you can get a 25% discount. So
we'll be circulating this, and thank you so much for contributing this to our audience. We will circulate this PowerPoint amongst the attendees, so you all will be able to check this out. Read that chart is amazing. I love what you did with that chart of like all the different income stream, like the different licensee types. And
so where you have to spend a little bit of time looking at it. To talk about it would just bore everybody to tears.
And And well, the next chart, I mean, the chart I'm looking for is like every country and, what they do and don't do in terms of US artists and labels. That's for another day. So, although maybe we'll talk about it a little bit. So thank you so much, Naomi. That was a great rundown. Love it. Hopefully, folks, if you have questions, put them in the little questions area. Ryan, I'd like to ask you to tell us about SoundExchange. There was a whole lot of asterisks that are yours, but to tell us about SoundExchange, tell us how, just tell us where it sits in the lay of the land of all that Naomi just ran through, and especially as it pertains to, well, give us the U.S. perspective of what SoundExchange does, but then the international side.
Sure. And first, I just want to thank Naomi for really doing an incredible job of clearly explaining what's really one of the most complicated areas of the music industry, which is already one of the most complicated copyright industries out there. So Naomi, great job on that. And everyone is here because they're really interested in these issues. So I don't know that you could really bore anyone with the complexity of neighboring rights. So sort of with Naomi's kind of introduction and explanation of the international context for neighboring rights, let me focus in on the US, which as Naomi said, is quite distinct. So in the US, we at SoundExchange administer what's called a statutory license for a pretty narrow set of rights. It's non-interactive digital audio transmissions of sound recordings. So think of it as digital radio. This very narrow set of rights, however, winds up being a really large proportion of overall neighboring rights collections internationally. While the right is very narrow in the US, it's extremely valuable. And at SoundExchange, for example, we collect and distribute nearly $1 billion with a B dollars per year for tens and tens and tens of thousands of artists and labels internationally. So because it's a statutory license, what that means is that artists and record companies are entitled to receive this money whether they're registered with SoundExchange or not. So a big part of our job, not just collecting the money, setting the rates, and allocating that money to the data, is actually going out and finding the people that need to be paid for this work. So some of the issues that Naomi talked about registering your work in order to be paid, are a little different at SoundExchange. The entitlement comes as a matter of law. You don't have to register recordings at SoundExchange as a precondition for being paid. It obviously helps a lot if you do that so that we can accurately associate the performance to the recording and the performer and the rights owner to the recording. So at SoundExchange, the money comes in. We allocate money to actual transmissions that take place. So we're allocating this, hundreds of millions of dollars to, millions upon millions of individual transmissions of recordings. The services that use the SoundExchange license are reporting every transmission they make. And we're paying out for those, for those aggregated micropennies. So having accurate data is really, really critical. So to put us a little bit more in international context, our money that we collect and pay out represents about a third of the global neighboring rights market, which is about $2.5 billion per year. A third of that is in the US with SoundExchange. About 50% of this, and Naomi and Anne, correct me if I'm wrong, and Carlo, you all know this better than I do. About half of the money is in the collecting societies in Western Europe. And then the remaining 20% is spread out around the world, but it's primarily in Asia, Australia, and Argentina and Brazil in South America. So registering. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's pretty much it. You pretty much nailed it there, Ryan.
So, it's critical to work with, I think, as many collecting societies as possible, but you obviously want to make sure that you're working with the big territories that represent the lion's share of the collections. So I think that's kind of the over US. Nita, do you have another question about?
So Ryan, tell us, I know this because I worked at SoundExchange for a billion years, but tell us about the international reciprocal agreements that SoundExchange has. How many, kind of where?
Sure, like many collecting societies, we have international relationships with partner organizations around the world with the other collecting societies. So we have something like 46 agreements in 34 territories that represent about 80% of the ex-US market. We're covered in all the large territories: UK, France, Germany, Spain, Japan, Canada, Brazil. But as Naomi pointed out, one of the big issues that SoundExchange, as a primarily US representing collective, has is the lack of protection for US artists and record companies abroad. Even though, the United States represents a huge chunk of global collections, Americans are typically not protected overseas. So one of the initiatives that SoundExchange and many of us in the industry have undertaken is really an effort to try to get Americans protected overseas to the same extent that locals in those territories are protected. And this is what you'll sometimes hear is the national treatment issue and national treatment campaign. And it really is focused on this discrimination that Americans face. We're not really looking for an expansion of rights. We're not looking for rights to be covered by equitable remuneration that are not currently covered. We're really just looking for basic fairness. Whatever rights are available in a territory, Americans should be given those rights as well. And
I want to get the national treatment with you in a second because it's so crucial. But can we pull back for just 1 second? I'm sorry to interrupt, but can we pull back into in the international reciprocal agreements that do exist with SoundExchange and your equivalent brother, sister, neighboring rights societies abroad? Is it a trading of like for like monies?
Well, so the short answer is no. There's a longer answer that I can get into, but it's basically the arrangement is with the other CMO, we're seeking to be paid whatever's collectively managed in that territory for whatever individuals we represent who are qualified to receive that remuneration in the territory. So for example, we represent a number of Europeans who would be qualified for terrestrial broadcast radio and for public performance collections in France, for example. So when we represent them, they will get paid that money. Right. The entitlement to the remuneration is always fact specific to the individual contributor and the nature of the sound recording. So who's doing the representation as a legal matter doesn't impact the entitlement to the remuneration. Whether a performer is represented by SoundExchange, by Sony ATV, or by Cobalt, or directly at the CMO, won't impact whether they're qualified to receive the remuneration.
Right. So it is about an artist at SoundExchange who then gives SoundExchange the mandate about providing the data behind their particular recording so that you can see that situation and should they have recorded in a Rome Convention country, as Naomi was pointing out, for example, that might be something where their SoundExchange might be able to get more out of that society coming back to an American artist who might have, had the drummer born in South Africa and recorded in Canada and whatever the combo is that makes it work. So it's not easy for you to actually just say, yeah, well, UK is giving us this and Senna and Holland's giving us that, right?
That's absolutely right. I mean, what you can do at a high level is look at the scope of rights that a territory collectively administers, and you can say whether they will treat Americans the same as their local nationals. And many territories do. Not many. Germany, for example, will do that. Brazil.
Right. There should probably be more, but yeah, I think, and I think that's also something that people always hear that, oh, as an American, you can't get any money. But there are, as you rightly said, Ryan, there are a handful of countries who pays to everyone, and therefore basically applies the national treatment to everyone. And Germany, as you pointed out, is one of them. Spain will be another one. Brazil. So, there's some top sort of 10 earning neighboring rights societies who would pay everyone. So, if you're American, recording on an American label, and your actual recording has taken place in America, that's kind of the worst case scenario when it comes to neighboring rights, but still you will get paid from some countries. So you should definitely.
definitely dive into that in detail in just a moment. Ryan, not to forget the fabulously important point about national treatment. Please continue and tell us. So there's just been a recent win, actually. SoundExchange industry organizations worked on helping American artists. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah. So the United States recently entered into a new trade agreement with Canada, which is an update of the NAFTA agreement called USMCA. And that agreement had a national treatment provision, which essentially said that the Canadians have to treat Americans just like they treat local Canadian artists and record labels, which had never been the case before. Canada has a broadcast and public performance right for sound recordings that Americans were previously ineligible for, but with passage of the USMCA and the entry into force in July, Americans are now protected. As a practical matter, the increase in royalties will take some time to work out because there needs to be a process for the Canadian Copyright Board to essentially true up its tariff to now cover the American repertoire that was previously not covered. So there will be a little bit of time before that money starts to flow, but it's an incredible development, and it really gives us a lot of encouragement for seeing national treatment protections really extend into other territories. I will say there's one other opportunity we have right now. The U.S. is also negotiating a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom right now that's getting a fair amount of attention. And the national treatment issue is sort of on the table there as well. The UK protects American recordings. It's a little nuanced, but American performers recording in the United States are not eligible for the equitable remuneration right. So they don't have the same ability that British performers have to get paid from the UK collective, get paid essentially directly when the recordings are played in bars and restaurants or streamed on radio broadcasts. So we and others are seeking to give Americans that same treatment and are looking to the FTA as a kind of vehicle for doing that.
I mean, that's what's so exciting. I think a lot of our attendees here know and have heard for years about sort of the advocacy work of the various music industry organizations, Recording Academy, SoundExchange, MMF, all was trying to get a performance right on terrestrial radio piece of legislation passed. It used to be called the Performance Rights Act, or now it's the AMFM Act, I believe. And what's so exciting is that that you all have sort of worked, instead of working over on Capitol Hill and trying to get a law passed because we were kept hitting walls, not that that battle isn't still ongoing, you've now come over to the trade representative and said, actually, let's get this right country by country as you negotiate trade agreements, as the United States negotiates trade agreements, to get national treatment language in there. And so, kudos to you guys for working on that, because it's exciting that we're going to get Canadian monies and hopefully UK monies, fingers crossed, for our American artists. Thank you, Ryan, for explaining that. And I want to turn back to sort of what Anne was touching upon, and we'll come through this. I'm going to actually turn to Carlo. Carlo, I'm giving you the hypothetical, and I know Naomi and Anne are going to jump into this too. I'm an American manager. I manage American artists. I have some weird accent right now. Anyway, I manage American artists, and they recorded in America, but maybe they didn't. Not really sure. I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, SoundExchange is. I'm registered with SoundExchange. SoundExchange has a mandate for me to collect for all the international monies. Why would I come to an agent such as Premier or Sony ATV or Cobalt? But I'll start with Carlo. Why would I come to an agent such as Premier at all? What are you guys doing for me?
Very good question. Thank you, by the way. Okay, so I'll start with something that's actually near and dear to my heart when it comes to this. Is Premier Music as an agent was actually founded by artists. So founded by artists who were actually looking for their royalties. So that in and of itself is intriguing to me. And fast forward a few years, over a decade, and we have about half the staff that are also artists and musicians. So that insight and that passion for it is unique. So that's one thing. So we think about this when we're living in two worlds. We have music business and you have the artists, and most of the time it's very important for an artist to be free to do what they need to do and what they're good at, which is art. You throw in the business side of that, it's distraction. And that's why we have business managers. That's why we have artist managers, lawyers, things like that. It's extremely important so that the artist is free to do what they need to do. On the other hand, speaking from experience and from the perspective of premium music, where we excel is in international collection. What we've noticed, and like Ryan had mentioned before with the reciprocals and stuff, is the agencies that we represent collectively here have these kind of, I wouldn't say deals, but we are mandated to collect in these territories. And from experience, again, they are very good at collecting locally. So let's say SoundExchange in the US, fantastic. PPL in the UK, very good. It comes to when they're collecting internationally, that's where we really saw the difference. And when we go direct, we're seeing, you know, a real spike in royalty collection, and a lot of that has to do with the work that goes into it. It is extremely difficult with multiple systems and all of this data flowing around, and you know, it can be as simple as titles that are misspelled. And I'm sure, and Naomi touched on this at the beginning of the webinar. This is a huge problem across the board for everybody. So that's one thing to look at, and we need to imagine that, and imagine how many artists these collecting societies are representing at once. Whereas an agent kind of has the freedom to be a little bit more like a chic boutique. We don't have hundreds of thousands of artists. We have artists that we represent, and it could be in the thousands, and we can really put in the time. And you know, it's detail oriented. Everyone, the goal is to be treated the same. So technological advancements are very important because we're noticing, and we've noticed that the collecting societies were struggling. So the struggle wasn't just ours, it was theirs, and it actually stems from there. So for example, matching of data, the majority of these tracks are being flushed because of their matching abilities. So we decided to build our own. We're actually in discussion with collecting societies and sharing information. Some of them are interested in our software. It's gotten to that point because the need was so immediate, and coming as an artist who collects royalties as well as works in administration, I've seen both sides. I've been personally affected by the lack of data or all of that. So it's something that, again, near and dear. So these are aspects and what an agent can bring to the table. Now, again, you're in good hands when you sign up even directly to a CMO. I mean, the important thing is that you are signing up somewhere, that you are educated about this. This is what today's webinar is all about. The decision is up to the artist who they want to represent them. So that's step one. Get some kind of representation or go direct, but there is no magic wand to collecting royalties. You have to put the work in. You can have the fanciest of gear or whatever reciprocal deals you want. You need to make sure you're claiming. You need to make sure that, and this is constant. And on top of it, we also realize that, you know, and this is Naomi and Anne can attest to this as well, is we're submitting claims to societies, correct? Now we're assuming that they are processing this properly. Not always the case. We needed a way to audit as well. So we're looking into ways, and we have, and it is working, is that we need to monitor airplay in these territories. Because if Lady Gaga has 3 top 10s for broadcast year 2020, but we get paid on 2, now we know that there's an issue. Whereas when you just submit claims and just hoping that you'll get something back and you'll be able to, you're a flow through, you'll pay off the artist, but are you getting everything for that artist? Are they being remunerated properly? And that comes into the credits again and all of that. So we educate people on that. Credits are extremely important, as Naomi and Anne and Ryan would tell you as well. So producer is very good. I love that people that we've touched on that as well today. Just one thing to clarify about Germany, artistic producers are paid, even if it's producer, but it is extremely important to be credited for everything you do. So a producer most likely will play the bass or drum program, someone like Trevor Horn, for example. I mean, this is a huge name, but we know for a fact that he's recorded, and a lot of the credits back then and even now for producers aren't that accurate. So it's extremely important to do that. And these are just some of the things we offer.
Thank you, Carla. Ryan, is SoundExchange collecting for, I mean, SoundExchange collects, sorry, I should say distributes to record producers under a letter of direction, typically from the artist share, so that the producer becomes a payee in the system. What happens with international royalties for producers? How does that flow?
So we currently are not paying studio producer royalties to foreign CMOs, and we're not collecting studio producer royalties from foreign CMOs.
I see. Okay.
Process.
There's a little bit of a catch-22 that happens with some producers, that if a artist doesn't have, so sorry, just really fast, I'm sorry to interrupt. One of the main reasons why somebody would get a representative is that, quite frankly, it's not something that an artist wants to do themselves. And we know all these rules and they don't. If an artist has only signed up with, say, a foreign CMO, and they have not signed up directly with SoundExchange in the US, or they don't have a representative who signed them up with SoundExchange directly in the US, they don't have a SoundExchange account, the producer on that account, the producer on that track, they can submit as many letters of direction as they want. There's no SoundExchange account to pay that producer. So it's another thing that the producer loses their US potential income if the artist hasn't taken the steps to become a member of the different societies.
Right, right. And so I have so many questions in my head. Does any of you guys, to answer the question, well, actually it's an Ann Carlo Naomi question, which is, do relationships matter? I've certainly talked to, Gino over at Premiere, for example, or, other royalty agents who have said relationships, we have American artists and we're shaking loose the trees of cash from, for artists who were typically so American, recorded in America, but we're getting stuff out of foreign societies. Can you tell me, how does that work? Is it true? Is it a myth?
Relationships is beyond important. You have to look at this as these collecting societies essentially are nonprofit organizations, and you usually have people who care about where this money is going. And as an agent, I mean, in the past, we haven't always had the best reputation when it came to collecting societies, and we can say vice versa as well for collecting societies in certain territories. So building these relationships has been crucial. And it's like putting a face to a name. We just feel a little better when we're dealing with people that way. We understand where they're coming from, and we have been helping them advance as well, which is something that, honestly, if you had told anybody, I believe in this panel or anyone watching or listening, that CMOs would be coming to agents for help, they probably would have laughed you out the room. But this is exactly what's happening. We've had talks with GVL, PPL, SoundExchange, potential collaborations, things like that, because the end game is to get the royalties to the artist quicker. That's the point.
I completely agree with that. I still think that there's a bit of a, agents is a dirty word. Me coming from the publishing industry and others in this group as well who do, where that doesn't exist in the publishing world. And I was kind of told when I came into neighboring rights, it's like, oh, it's going to be so different from publishing and it's the Wild West. And I'm like, yeah, people are exaggerating. It was much worse than I thought it was. And the fact, I mean, first of all, we're talking about technology. And yes, now, finally, societies are sort of starting to look at technology as a bigger piece of the jigsaw, if you like. But you still have, societies operating on their own. Having said that, there is some collaboration. There are initiatives happening, and that's all good, but they're still having sort of their own, of course, licensing systems, but also their distribution systems. And it's also down to the fact that each society had their own rules that we were talking about previously, and that would be the most important reason why you would go to an agent, because as Carlos rightly said, that we don't have tens of thousands of clients. that we look after. So we can spend the time that is required to do this very, very diligent work, because that's what it is. It's a lot of manual work, even though of course we use technology where we can. But you know, some societies it's required you go on to their portal and you claim track by track. It's extremely time consuming, but that's what you do, and that's how you maximize the income, because you do it track by track. You do it yourself. You see that it's done. You don't sort of rely on a file being sent to the society and they process it, and then you know you don't know what's happening with it once it's left you. And another thing also that is really important, it's not like you go and do this work once. You need to go back and recheck and recheck and recheck, because things suddenly just get overwritten in society system. We see it all the time, because if they have labels sending them data, lots of societies tend to trust the label more than an artist performer, so they override the claim. So you need to go back in and reclaim it. You know, you know, anyone who has the time to do that themselves, that's great. I think most, as you also said, artists are creative. They should create music. They shouldn't have to deal with admin. It is very time consuming, and it's still, because everyone has their own rules. If everyone paid everyone, it would be so much easier, you know. But we're not there. Maybe one day we will, but not quite yet.
Ryan, this question might be for you, and that might be I don't know, which is, because SoundExchange is a nonprofit and the other societies are a nonprofit, I know I'm aware that there are some tax treaties between two countries when you're trading monies from nonprofit to nonprofit. There does not need to be a withholding at source. Do you have any intel on that? And is that something that if I'm a manager and I'm trying to analyze between not using an agent, going to SoundExchange only? Talk about that.
I'm not sure that in the US, the tax treatments are that different whether you're going with SoundExchange or the agent. So in the US, tax issues are really complicated. This is not legal advice, but I'll try to summarize this as best as I can. So the US sourced money going out is subject to withholding in the US. And it's different withholding whether you're a US person or a non-US person. Now, SoundExchange can reduce that withholding if we get certain documentation from the individual or the individual's representative. And we can reduce it to 0 in the case of a US person, or we can reduce it to something less than the standard backup withholding for a non-US person, based on whatever tax treaty is in place between the US and the person's residence. Often that's 0 as well. But we need this information on an individual by individual basis. And I know Anne and Naomi and Carla are very familiar with this process.
Yeah, well, but if SoundExchange is, you know, paying out, say, to PPL in the UK or Senna in the Netherlands, are you not doing sort of a lump sum?
It's not for the US source money. There's not really a great way to do that. We need the foreign CMO to give us the individual information for each performer in order to reduce the backup withholding.
I see. They would have the tax implication as individuals, and not like you're just sending a big old check to one society who happens to be a nonprofit. And thank you for clarifying.
It's another reason to get a representative, because as Ryan said, Carlo, myself, and Anne, this is something that we do all the time. We're always after artists for tax forms.
Right, right. And to find them, what about to find them tax benefits if possible, I suppose. So any of you, what about working with your clients, with the artist managers, in sort of future strategy? You know, do you sit and counsel them about, you know, how to plan their recordings into the future so that they?
Absolutely.
I know we can talk about this, but Anne, you know, go for it. Anyone?
I mean, I'll give an example. We had a US band who we signed way back in the early days of Cobalt neighboring rights, and they didn't get that much international money, and we advised them to try and record elsewhere, so record in their own convention country. So they decided to record while they were on tour, and their income, I mean, it went up several 100%, because they had a big hit that was recorded in Europe that made a massive difference. Another thing that can help, if you're based in the US, you should a second passport. If you have you could get a European passport. If you've got Irish grandparents or whatever it might be, that helps to sort of increase your international collection. So things like that we definitely advise people to look into.
Wonderful.
Tell them to go to Canada or Mexico.
Yeah, that's it. But it's
Carlo, do you guys just bring people? Do you have a recording studio Premiere in Montreal? Do you just...
Well, I mean, we do actually. But no, she nailed it right there. That's exactly it. It's one of the most important things that we've tried to educate the artists for. It's the thing is, we have to understand that the rights holders are normally the record label. Now, Naomi touched on this at the beginning at one point, where, let's say, for example, in the UK, when the performer side of it, that piece of the pie is not qualified, it will go to the rights owner. So if you think about it, it's not really in their interest to have the performer qualify, is it? So we have to start looking at these things, and that's just the reality. And the easiest way was, when they are touring or if they're out of the country, I mean, with technology these days, you're not necessarily even going into a recording studio. Your tour bus is a recording studio. Your hotel room is a recording studio. You have a laptop. You have all of this cool gear that we have these days, and it opens the doors up. And we were able to have American artists qualified just because the vocals were recorded on a track through a laptop and a microphone. And that's just the truth. So this is something everybody should be looking into.
Even if the laptop and microphone was in Michigan, I mean,
as long as the credit, well, no, the laptop is with you physically wherever you are. So and it's important to be credited that way, that the recordings were done in London, were done in Canada. A lot of times it is studios, yeah, because a lot of artists take advantage when they're visiting another country to collaborate with other artists as well. There's an artist that they highly respect, or a producer that they'd like to work with. So, I mean, a simple invoice from your time in that studio could have been 2 hours, and that opens the doors as well. And then, of course, as
how much is enough? What's de minimis versus, I mean, is it okay to just get a hand clap or tambourine track from somebody in Sweden, put it into the recording, but everything else is US made?
Only that hand clap or tambourine shake would be qualifying in that case. You need to.
How do you get the recording, the whole track to qualify? I'm sorry. Is it looked at that way, or is it looked at as just
whatever is recorded in the country, other countries qualify? Sorry, I totally interrupted you, Carlo. I think you were about to.
No, it's fine. No, go ahead. You're going to say the same thing I will.
Go for it, Naomi. Yes. What were you saying?
Yeah, it's whatever is recorded in that country is what's qualifying. I mean, we've had it where, a band that had recorded like strings in Canada came to us, to say, oh, this has been in Canada, therefore it's qualified. No, just the strings then is qualifying.
Just strings. And so it wouldn't be that you have a 5-member band, one of them records, the drum track in Sweden. I'm just saying Sweden or Canada.
Then the drum track is qualifying.
It's only the drummer who gets featured artist.
Well, no, everybody would get featured artists, but the only one who would be paid directly would be the drummer in the countries that don't pay non-qualifying performers. Right. So if you have a drummer who is Swedish, and then you have a guitar player who recorded in Sweden, and then you also have a bass player and a vocalist, and they recorded in America and they're Americans, then from some of the countries that have the non-qualifying reciprocity issues, like the UK, the guy who is Swedish and the guy who recorded in Sweden, they would get paid directly, and the remaining, the bassist and the vocalist who are American, that money would go to the label.
Mm-hmm. And Ryan, when SoundExchange is claiming, do you actually have to make those?
Yeah, rescind.
There's an American band, but there's a European drummer, for example. Do you differentiate that in your claims?
Yeah, when we send claims to foreign CMOs, we include as much metadata about individual recordings and the contribution that we have. And often, these are quite manual processes to ensure that the particular recording is getting paid and credited the way it should be. I would like to highlight one point that I think, Nita, you mentioned earlier. The nature of these rights is very different than the music publishing or authors' rights abroad. I think Anne was raising this, and it's really worth highlighting. The authors' rights are exclusive rights. So the business relationships are all based around private contracts that are negotiated between authors, collecting societies, and publishers locally and internationally. The neighboring rights are almost always going to be equitable remuneration rights, which are based in a local territory's law. So they're, by definition, going to be very different from territory to territory. And the international copyright treaties are very high level about how they describe the similarities between the rights. So even in Europe, you can't really get a single European-wide way of viewing copyright rights. You still have to view them by each individual territory. So it adds a level of complexity and challenge that you don't really see on the author's rights side.
Did we lose Nita?
I believe we may have lost Nita, our humble host. But look, for everyone else, there's another aspect of agents as well that's been coming up that's really interesting. There are countries in the world that just don't have the infrastructure. They don't have even a CMO. But with technology, there are artists that are just popping up all over the place. I mean, someone on the African continent, in a country where there is no CMO or something like that, can upload music to the internet, and who knows? I mean, this could be the next Michael Jackson. We don't know. And we've actually had some artists sign up with Premiere that are from these types of places, and they're starting to slowly collaborate with other people. And it's just unfortunate that they don't have any other way out than being with someone who was either, through word of mouth. It could be Sony, it could be Cobalt, it could be Premiere. That really helps them. And that's definitely a direct result of technology, because these artists can actually record music. And then we have the other territories, and more people are asking about China, Mexico. I mean, there's no intellectual property there. I mean, that's already number one, is an issue. Then we have the places like Mexico, and we have to remember that as agents as well, we're liable for the information we have. This is highly sensitive information, like your passports and the artists, all of that stuff. We have to think twice before we get in bed with anybody. So that's another thing. But we're liable for that, and we're going to educate, and we hold that to heart. We're not playing fast and loose with this just to say, oh, let's go get a buck. I mean, if the risk is too high, then we may not go. And you know what? We may deal with a CMO and maybe mandate them to collect in another, as long as they're, someone has to get to some kind of agreement in there. So that's another aspect that's important to consider.
I agree. And then just to add on to that, so I mean, we're often asked about Latin America, and of course Brazil is a country that pays, that's working really well. I mean, there are other countries that did sign the Rome Convention and therefore should be paying neighboring rights royalties, but actually are not. They collect the license and they collect, but they only pay to their local performers. That's kind of something that they've decided, way back when, and they're kind of sticking to that. And I think, that's a big issue in the sense that there are lots of countries who should actually be paying, and the money is not flowing. And that's one of the things also, I think, it's a big issue for the neighboring rights world, and that's also something that in IFR, that's one of the reasons why we started that, to sort of get a conversation going. I mean, I'm sure there are conversations going in terms of societies, but for us as agents and the clients we represent, sorry, my dog is barking because our alarm is going, so I'm going to put myself on mute.
Yeah, I just want to pick up with that, because that's a really good point that Anne made. I mean, that the fact that some of these societies that should be paying aren't paying, these are things that IFR is trying to advocate for and trying to work on. And this is why, you know, anybody who's in the neighboring rights world, we hope gets involved with IFR either as a member, or we have a category called Friends of IFR, and we really do need the support. We're you know, trying to, you know, essentially we're building ourselves up to the point where we'd be able to then, you know, try and deal with these things that are not happening that should be happening.
Yeah, and just to reiterate that, I mean, when I was in working in publishing, we had sort of all these working groups, publishers working with societies to kind of make things better, and that I still feel that that's lacking in the neighboring rights world. I mean, we all have our individual relationships with the CMOs, but there's not sort of that unified effort, and I think, you know, it's the classical together we're stronger, so that's where we want to sort of work together. We all have sort of the same issues, and if we all get together and work pushing those issues, we'll hopefully get resolutions to them a little bit quicker.
Wonderful. So I had a little technical, I think the power went out for a quick second, so I had to like leave and come back in and use my phone as a hotspot. Thank goodness for the Wi-Fi routers in our phones. Wesley, because I just sent you a text. Just look at it. I need to get back in so I can take a look at the questions. If you could put me in there as organizer, thanks. Because I'd love to turn us all over to questions for a moment before we close up. I love this discussion information in here, so thank you. It's been very good. And actually, Wesley, I might ask you, if you could actually go through a couple of the questions.
Yes, that's all good. So we have probably the most questions we've ever had on a webinar. So I think
that's good or bad.
I think it's because it's a very in-depth and complicated subject, and there are all sorts of questions about should American artists be trying to record things abroad? Should we be trying to make sure that, you know, things were very, very accurately geographically reported as to where they're recorded? And I think that's all been covered. The other main batch of questions are, when is it best to deal directly with international rights societies, or have a specific country collect on your behalf, or SoundExchange or something like that?
Or an agent, right?
Or an agent, yeah. There's maybe 10 questions like that.
Yeah, I might go through some of those, Wesley, in depth, because if you guys have time, and if you need to leave, let us know. We might go over time, but I think it's an important subject, and I'm seeing some very good questions in here. Yeah, so Wesley, you were saying, yeah, the question is really about when would you suggest, any of you want to jump in, that someone go direct to a foreign society? I mean, I know it's
my answer to that is, you know, if you're getting airplay in a foreign society, then you should probably be going direct with that society. I think, you know, Anne mentioned some countries like Germany, Brazil, and Spain pay Americans directly. Now, if you don't have any airplay at all in Spain or Germany or Brazil, then you're not going to get paid, not because, you know, you're not an American, you're an American, it's because you're not getting the airplay. But if you're getting the airplay, and you know, then you should look into going direct with, and to be honest, I don't think that any sane human being could really handle more than like one society or two societies. I think that's when you have to like look into getting an agent. You know, if you're getting international airplay, or if you don't want to be keeping tabs on your repertoire, and you know, even at SoundExchange, if you don't want to be going into the search and claim function however often to make sure that you have been put on all your recordings, you know, that's when you should get an agent to help you.
Yeah, I think it depends on how much time you've got to spend yourself on sort of either going direct and doing it yourself, or depends on what you think a society CMO could actually do for you internationally. And again, it goes back to, you know, how much activity do you have, what is actually required in order to make sure you get everything you should be paid for. So I think it depends on the circumstances. There's not one answer that fits everyone.
Right.
Yeah, and I would just add that's right. I mean, at SoundExchange, we take the view that we will work with performers generally however they like. If they want to work with an agent, that's fine. If they want to work with the CMO, that's fine as well. I will say that I think, as a general matter, it probably makes a lot of sense to come direct to SoundExchange, regardless of what level you're at, because, we're collecting money on a monthly basis and paying out on a monthly basis. Many CMOs pay out once or twice a year. We're paying monthly. So, if you come direct to us, you'll get your money, more of it, and faster. So, that for some CMOs that may not be the case. For us, we feel pretty strongly that it makes a lot of sense for folks to come direct.
Yeah, it's I agree with all of that, and even with Ryan, I mean, we've often carved out even the US and have them stay direct, and we'll take care of the rest of the world. I mean, it really is up to the artist, and that's fine. And sometimes they decided to give us everything because they saw that we were doing such a good job internationally. And we've been approached by artists saying, well, look, I'm with PPL or whatever. We say, look, how is it going? Are you okay? Like, do you like it? If you come to us, it's fine. Sometimes we'll tell you to stay where you are, but it really is up to you. But you have to also think is what level of service do you want? I mean, if you want to call an organization who unfortunately can't get back to you that quickly, that's fine if you're not in a hurry for anything. But at least in cases where we have an agent, most likely when you call up, we're answering. I mean, it's within 24 to 48 hours, you're getting your answer. But again, we're working together with the CMOs. So again, carve out one territory, go direct with SoundExchange, give us the remainder, we'll do that. It can be Germany, all of that. So I mean, we're flexible. Everybody's got their own story. Every artist is treated differently as far as artistically, but once they're with us, they're treated exactly the same. You're part of the family, and that's what it is.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. And that is the thing, is you can carve out certain countries go through an agent, certain countries go direct, certain countries go through SoundExchange. There is that variety and that ability of flexibility to choose a little bit. Sorry, we use acronyms, and somebody asked, what's a CMO? It stands for Collective Management Organization, and I apologize as a moderator. I should have gotten through that and made sure that everyone knew what a CMO was. So collective, it means the society as opposed to sort of the middlemen, companies, organizations, agents that work between. The societies are the ones who collect and distribute the royalties initially, let's just say. And so SoundExchange is, in that sense, a CMO. Although, yeah, but working under the collection and distribution under a statutory license, with some other little bells and whistles on the side. One of the questions was, is there a scenario where a performer on the recording would not be eligible to collect a share of the performer's royalty, like a work for hire? And does every performer get an equal share? I know this is,
That's
Ryan,
a loaded question.
Yeah. I know the answer to this one, but I'll let you guys take it.
Well, sorry, somebody else want to? I've talked a lot, so I'm happy to defer to anybody.
Go for it, Naomi.
There's so much.
There's so much. So, okay, outside of the US, equitable remuneration is not assignable, saleable, transferable, or in any other way something that you can give to anybody other than your designated beneficiary when you die. And even that, you practically have to exhume a body in some countries before you're actually able to give that to your beneficiary.
And I know a guy back who might do it, and I'm joking.
Yeah. So, it doesn't matter whether it's production music, work for hire, library music, or if it's top 10 hit, in the sense that you as the performer have the legal right outside, and again, all of this is outside of the US, to collect your equitable remuneration. Now, library music, work for hire, production music, whatever you want to call it, if the work for hire is library music, as it normally is, it's not always registered because there are a lot of territories that don't pay for production music. And as I mentioned, if the rights holder hasn't registered the recording, the performer cannot get money. So
Right.
in the UK, for instance, there's a triple weighting system that happens at MCPS to pay production music on the publishing side. And the reason there's a triple weighting for library music, production music on the publishing side is because PPL does not pay production music. So you're not going to get your work for hire equitable remuneration from PPL in the UK. Now in Brazil, it's a different story. You can definitely get paid in Brazil. And, but again, then it goes back to, is that getting airplay in Brazil? Because even though you could get paid from Brazil, if it's not getting airplay, then you won't earn money. Now, in the US, it's different. You can assign your income stream to somebody else. I've seen that happen. I've seen contracts where, one member of a band essentially owns somebody else's soul from that band and everything's paid to that person. But that's because the laws, equitable remuneration is not law in the US. It's a different type of right. And there is an audiovisual right that you can get paid via the AFM SAG-AFTRA fund. And that's its own thing altogether. But at the end of the day, there's so many ins and outs. And if you've got a status of work for hire, there's so many other questions that start coming up.
Right. But if production music is released, now there's a ton of production music on Spotify, for example, but that's on-demand streaming. But nonetheless, there is, that's been commercially released as a sound recording, where it's no longer, being used in a library setting. So if it does transformed in a sense, it's being commercially released as a sound recording on the market, then it might qualify in that sense.
It might be registered at PPL if it's been soft released on Spotify, in which case, yes, the performer can go in and make their claim. But if they're a non-qualifying performer, then they're only going to get money from satellite and digital as opposed to getting the terrestrial, which is going to go to the label anyway.
Yeah, but it's very interesting, actually, because I like that they touched on audiovisual as well. That's library music. We're pretty much talking audiovisual. And you have TV stations and things like that are giving this kind of playlist. And there are music houses all over, like the US and Canada and UK, Netherlands, like APM, Massive Music. They have a roster of artists, and they're like kind of the unsung heroes of music. You don't really see them. They're not touring musicians. You won't see them in a music video. But when you're watching a movie trailer or something like that, these are the people who are putting that music together and performing that music. And there are societies, some CMOs, that pay out on this. And Germany is one of them. UBC and some societies in Brahmas, I believe, in Brazil has been actually very surprising. And we've done very well for these audiovisual artists. And that's really cool. Because when someone calls you, an artist calls you and says, well, I can buy Christmas gifts for my kids this year, that's something that, is not to be taken lightly. Not everybody is a multimillionaire that is in the music industry. And it's important that they keep doing what they do. It's super important. That's why everyone here, I believe, is here for this reason, to advise them of how to do this. And, I'll take a moment to thank everybody here, the panelists and anybody listening, because it's what we do is crucial, and never more than right now, especially right now.
And also, just to your point, Carlo, that the fact that this information, that the stuff we're talking about now, the AV, the audiovisual income in Brazil, for instance, it's not, you can't just go out and read about it. We've had, as agents, we've had to dig into this really, really deeply and go and ask specific questions of each society in order to find out whether or not they cover payments for these type of performances. So that's another piece of work that an agent would actually do, which I think many people probably don't know about. But we go and on a fact-finding mission and sort of ask the right questions to help you get more money.
Yeah. Right. There's so many good questions. Okay, I wanted to have Ryan comment on something, but I kind of want to go on to the next. Ryan, do you want to talk about it all, like the SoundExchange, work for hire, but also that second question, which was about whether does every performer get an equal share? Oh, do you have a mute button on?
Sorry about that. And I know we're sort of coming up on time as well, so I don't want to take too much time. But at SoundExchange, the way the split works is the record company gets 50%, the featured performer gets 45%, and then we send 5% of the total collection over to another organization called the AFM and SAG-AFTRA Intellectual Property Rights Distribution Fund. We and everyone else just call it the fund because it's quite a mouthful. And then they run their own distribution to paid non-featured musicians and vocalists. So the assumption on the featured artist share is that it's a pro rata split unless we get information that tells us otherwise. And we will pay it out however the featured performers want it to be divvied up. And then on library music, I mean, the statutory license applies to commercially released sound recordings. So if library music, for some strange reason, is commercially released and played on one of the services that we administer, we would make an allocation for that, and whoever owns it and performs on it would have an entitlement to come be paid by SoundExchange.
Great. Okay, great. Someone asked, does SoundExchange accept mandates from US agents to collect from SoundExchange on behalf of artists?
So our sort of policy is we work with agents all the time. We work with Anne, Carlo, and Naomi every day. We make payments to the performer himself or herself, but work with agents to get the performer registered, to get the documentation, and then the agent acts as sort of the registered contact on the account to really communicate with us on behalf of the performer.
Great. Okay, some of these questions were answered. Hey, Wesley, did you have any others that you spotted?
The main other questions that I was thinking of going through are assigning and selling neighboring rights. And that was something that came up right as we were doing the prep as well. And there were a couple questions around that. So this is something that we've definitely been seeing happen. And I'd love any information on how does this work, and is it really a functional kind of system or reassignment or sale of a right?
Right. Someone, Naomi mentioned that neighboring rights may be considered unassignable, which is often said, but aren't neighboring rights bought and sold on a regular basis these days? Eager to hear panelists' input on assignability.
Yeah, you can't assign the rights to somebody else. That's absolutely true. So what people are doing here, they're basically selling the income stream, the right to receive the money. So it's yes, you can do that because people do that. I think will it work? Yes and no. I think as long as if you as an artist, you've sold your rights, and that's fine. Somebody else collects that money on your behalf. But if, let's say, take GVL in Germany as an example, if you move, because GVL is one of the societies who insist on having the home address for the performer, they send statements to the performer. Even if you have a rep on the account, if you've got an agent or somebody collecting on your behalf, they still insist on sending a statement to that person. If that bounces back because you have moved, then they stop the payment. They're not paying anyone anymore until they've got a proper documentation in place. So, that's, in my view, where it kind of would fall down at some stage, because, if you sold your income stream, you got your money and off you go. It's kind of the person then, or the company, who has to make sure that keeps ticking. That for me would be where the issue is, and just going on to that. So, in this day and age where Carlo mentioned earlier that, passport copies, we need to send passport copies in color to the societies. It can't be a black and white copy. It has to be in color. And, they compare the documentation. You have a power of attorney that you deal with everything to do with neighboring rights. I, as an artist, have given to Naomi to do for me, but still they kind of, the stuff that they won't do, like the sending statements, they won't say that, oh, we can only send statements to you, we can send them to the artist as well. They compare the signature on that power of attorney with the signature on the passport to make sure that it actually matches. And I think that's where, we should be using technology. We should be using the fact that agents work on behalf of the client. We have a right to collect the money. There's so much extra work that goes into managing this income stream based on that. But I think just going back to what the question was, yes, I think it is possible to actually sell the income stream for neighboring rights, but at some stage you'd be falling into some of these cracks. That will sort of be the downside to that, I would say.
Got it. So there is no way to reassign the actual copyright. It's just factoring for the accounts receivable for the royalties.
Yeah.
Basically. Great.
Correct.
And then putting a whole lot of protections in case the buyer, if you're the seller, comes after you, that you have a whole lot of disclaimer, type, language in there to protect you from the fact that they may not get everything they thought they were getting. Okay, I'm going to do one last question, but I do want to say there's a lot of questions in here that I know could be actually aimed at SoundExchange's team of folks that answer questions. So Ryan, if folks want to ask SoundExchange specific questions, is there a person or an email address? Is it info@SoundExchange? Where should they go?
Yeah, the best general inbox is the info@SoundExchange box, which our customer service team monitors and then divvies up the questions.
Right, thank you. Yeah, because there's a lot of good, sort of questions, but there are definitely mechanics around how to deal with rights owner side or splits on rights owner, splits on artists on various recordings. So I think, the customer service folks at SoundExchange could address those. I'm putting myself out there because I was at SoundExchange for 8 years, so I'm always happy as Music Managers Forum is a resource for you guys. You can email me a question, I'll try to answer it, or at least lead you to someone at SoundExchange that could. My email again is Neeta, Neeta @MMF-US.com. Okay. Last question here that I'll go for is, are the monies distributed to the fund? So we're talking about the non-featured artists. Are the monies distributed to the fund collected globally or just in the US? And are, this question, and are non-featured performer funds distributed similarly in other countries?
So
big question.
Let me speak to the US point first. So the SoundExchange under the Copyright Act, SoundExchange pays roughly 5% of the collection over to the fund, which they then have their entirely own distribution methodology to pay out for non-featured musicians and vocalists. And then the fund enters into reciprocal agreements with foreign CMOs abroad to exchange non-featured performer money. So
the way that SoundExchange is a reciprocal with PPL, the fund does as well, for example.
Yeah.
And just to elaborate a bit, so the 5% that SoundExchange pays to the fund is then split further in half between essentially vocalists, which is the SAG-AFTRA arm, and the AFM, which is essentially not vocalists, the instrumentals, on the AFM arm.
But one does not be a member of the union to collect from the fund.
Well, there's a lot of issues and a lot of questions surrounding that particular point, actually. I mean, to start with, there's some issues with the mandate question in terms of the way that the union functions in some of their bylaws. So this is one of the things that we as IFR are exploring, because there are many cases where due to a bylaw, somebody who was never a member of a union but was on a union performance, so essentially falls under the Taft-Hartley Act, has a mandate that's been claimed internationally by the fund, which essentially can prevent the performers from signing up with any other society. And this is an ongoing thing, and one that IFR is exploring various avenues to deal with as aggressively as we can, really. Also, just in terms of percentages, I mean, it does vary. I mean, if Elton John's in front of a 40-piece orchestra, the percentages for each of those people in the orchestra is going to be very different than if it's just like Elton John with one harmonica player or something. But for instance, PPL in the UK pays roughly 7% to a non-featured performer, 7 to 9% depending. It does vary. I mean, 5% is low, I'd say, on a global level. Outside of the US, most non-featureds get more than 5% unless there's more than, a handful on a track. I don't know if anybody else wants to expand on that.
No, I think the only thing to mention there, yeah, again, different societies have different rules, and there's some societies who apply like a point system. So the more instruments you play, the more you get paid. But there's also a cap on how many you can be paid for. I can't remember if it's 4 or 5. But so there's different methodologies that different societies apply when it comes to the non-featured share. Sure.
Yeah, the EFM is definitely something interesting is the word I'll use for now. Yeah. I mean, as Naomi mentioned, it's an ongoing issue as far as the mandate goes. And let's be clear, we've just more than once said that this is specifically for non-featured artists. We've had featured artists blocked by AFM. This makes no sense. So we have to look at this. And this is, again, because of that bylaw. Again, something we're looking at. And thankfully, over recent years, I'd say since about 2019, we've seen a lot of CMOs now decide to move that aside and are saying, well, if we have a mandate, we can prove our mandate. I'm sure all of us here, we have the artist signature, we have the passport, we have everything we need. If AFM can come up with some kind of mandate within, let's say, 2 weeks, well, we have the mandate. I mean, we are proxy for the artist. And that was a very big step, because for a few years, we've seen how much of an effect this had on some of the artists. Because let's say, for example, we had a group. We had non-featureds in that so-called group, because let's say if you look at Bon Jovi is the featured, the rest of the artists are not considered featured artists, they're non-featured. Now, if one of the members did not have an AFM conflict, let's say, well, he was remunerated and the rest of those others were not. So we can tell how much they lost. So this was a big deal, and it's something, and we've heard directly from artists who deal with the AFM that they have almost no feedback when they try to contact them and all of that, and that's an issue. I mean,
I would say no feedback, not almost. Forget the word almost. The AFM does not reply to emails.
There you go. So that's a huge issue, and it's important to know these things. And non-featured across the rest of the world is completely different, and it's important to be credited for what you do. Again, if you're a backup singer, if you played the bass, if you did play the triangle, this is important as well, and this comes from the rights holders too. Whatever they're exchanging, whether it's DDEX files or all of this stuff, there are a lot of holes in there, so metadata is extremely important. We have, CMOs like SoundExchange, for example, they're, I would say, light years ahead of a lot of them, and a handful of others that are really up there, and really, we deal with them every day. As Ryan said, we can tell the difference, and it's much better for the artist as well.
Yeah. Well, we were running really late here, but it's been such a great conversation. I didn't want it to stop, and I can tell there's a lot of interest from all these great questions. Anyway, I want to thank all of you fabulous experts for joining us, giving us your wisdom. If anyone wants to reach out, email me, Nita at MMF, and I can try to funnel the question to our fabulous experts. I do look forward to thank you all for participating. Thank you again to Iberia Bank, First Horizon Bank for their generous support of MMF and of this program. And thank you all for joining us, the audience out there. And we look forward to meeting you up with you in person someday, but also seeing you out there in our webinar land, in a webinar coming soon. I think we have one coming up in a couple of weeks again on sync licensing. Thank you, and stay safe, be healthy, and stay productive. And I'll talk to y'all later. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.